just go/present. The short one is go/present dash Fugu. No, dash Fugu.
This one?
Yep. No slash, but no slash, just a dash.
Excuse me. I do have one more announcement. For Googlers who have the building passes, please return them before the end of the day.
Yeah, we'll go over that at the end of the day. And
yes.
we also went over that before you got in.
In case people leave early.
Good.
Cool. Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
So I should be standing here. Okay. Cool. Hi, I'm Namrata. I'm the UX designer on the Fugu team. I have met many of you in the past 3 days. If I haven't met you till now, then maybe we should meet. So catch me up in one of the breaks. So today I would like to talk about, I think I've been on the team now for like 8 months. And today I think I would like to talk about the stuff that I've learned working in the past 8 months on the different Fugu APIs. I also hope to shed some light around like how we go about thinking about these APIs from a UX standpoint, and probably enable everyone here to do the thinking on their part and make some decisions faster. So this is like a quick overview of what I'll be talking. The time is just loose indicator of how much time I'll be spending, but the idea is to leave some time at the end for like discussion and any questions anyone might have about whatever I'm presenting today. So I like to think of the work that we do on Fugu like building roads or bridges. So like necessary infrastructure that needs to be there so that developers can actually ship amazing experiences for their end users. And stuff like this requires, it's like a monumental task. It requires a lot of people working together to make it happen. So engineering, product management, DevRel, partnership, marketing, UX, everyone together has to work closely with amazing teamwork to make such a mission happen. And it's amazing that this mission actually resonates across companies. We have people from Microsoft and Intel in the room. Is an example of a project which is, it's pretty rare in a project to actually have this amount of coordination and teamwork. And I would like to believe that everyone in this room actually cares deeply about developers' experience as well as the end user experience. That's the only way we can actually make the web feel like a premium platform, is if all of us actually care about those two aspects. So how can UX help? How can UX actually help the entire team? And this is just apart from like making the desired mocks. In the past few months, I have noticed a couple of ways that UX can effectively help the entire team. And I would like to highlight the top ones. So helping bring the team on the same page. When there are multiple stakeholders involved, it's sometimes difficult for everyone to be on the same page about the problem and the solution that we're talking about. One example that comes to mind is that we work on the file system API and we had multiple rounds of discussion around permission models. And I think seeing the mocks and seeing the end user impact of those permission models helped the entire team move towards a decision faster. So that's a learning I had when it comes to how UX can help. Iterating and gathering feedback faster. So granted, not every API needs this, but in some cases, we want to solicit feedback from partners even before origin trial. So this is a learning we had during the SMS OTP retrieval API, where it was just faster to show partners mocks and videos versus building out every single approach and iterate way more quickly and feel comfortable with what we're shipping in origin trial. Creating a vision for the future. So sometimes it's useful to visualize what the future can look like and work our way backwards from it. So this could be showcasing what it would look like if some of the native apps came on the web. It could also be visualizing the ideal end state for an API if there were like fewer implementation constraints. And in some cases, it can even be just being the brush for a teammate's idea. Like someone comes up to me and says like, hey, I think this is a really cool idea. What do you think about this? Just being able to visualize that idea is also really powerful. And of course, helping every member be a mini UX designer. I think this one is a little bit of a work in progress, but the idea is that with having like good templates and principles documented, we can enable most team members to make quick UX decisions without the designer being there in the room. Today, I'm going to talk about the UX process, some frequently used UI patterns, and also talk a little bit about the example APIs and how we went about making some decisions. Is a start and an attempt to document some of our thinking so that going forward, people can actually use these documents to actually work on APIs. It's still a work in progress. A lot more can be done here, but this is a start. So UX process, how does like a UXer work with the team while building, solving a problem, and in our case, working on an API? So the first step is basically problem definition. We work really closely with the team to understand what the team is, what the API capability is. So this would mean like understanding what the end user benefit is, what partner flows are we looking at to trying to solve, and what are the existing alternatives, like native alternatives. Like, are we trying to replace an existing native solution on the web? So understanding that problem is very important. Next would be idea generation. So a UXer will work with the team to generate multiple solutions for the problem that we identified earlier, and then work with different stakeholders to get feedback. This will be privacy, security. This will also be other UXers working on the entire product. And the idea is that at this particular stage, we can actually also start giving feedback on, say, the permission model, or we can also give feedback, say, to the requirements, like they don't make sense looking at all these different variations. So this phase also helps us starting to actually visualize what success of an API would look like. Like ideally, if we could go as crazy as possible into the future, what could this API look like? This design direction is like the part where we make sure everyone signs off, or we have everyone's approval on whatever we have decided to launch for origin trial. So this would mean all stakeholders, privacy, security, and also sign off from the Chrome product if there's any change in the user-facing UI. And this is because this impacts not just the Chrome browser, but all Chromium-based browsers. So we need to be aware of, we need to get sign-off from the product team also at this particular point. The next phase is basically refinements. Things like, do the strings look okay? Is everything spec'd out? Basically unblocking engineering from any issues so that they can actually go ahead and start implementing and start working on the API. The final phase, implementation, I think the UXer primarily tries to evaluate the implementation and see if everything looks good and file bugs if something is missing. The idea is also to document at this point how we're going to measure the success of this particular API, or how we're going to measure the UI that we are launching. And lastly, also create a launch approval deck. So screenshots of all the stuff that is changed, and get so that we can get the bit flip for the UX launch. And lastly, once we ship the API for origin trial, is evaluation. So checking in with the entire team is in terms of like, are we doing good? Does everything look okay? And is the API launch, can we consider it successful? This is also a point where ideally we would like to collect feedback from partners and make any changes for the next origin trial. So now, before we saw the UX process, now I'm just going to look at some commonly used UI patterns that we have in the product today. And the idea being that we mostly try to reuse these patterns. So tomorrow, if you're going to start working on a new API, this would be useful place to start. But the caveat being that in some cases, you might realize that your API needs something different. And in that case, we should talk. So most APIs require that you give access to the site. The site has to give, the user has to give access to the site to a particular capability. So the one on the left is a very familiar allow block prompt that you guys would have seen especially with notifications. But the idea being that this is a one-time persistent permission that you are granting. On the right, you have a device picker, and this is slightly different because you're choosing a specific device to give access to, and this is only on a per device basis versus a blanket, you can access all these devices. And lastly, we also have like a per file permission with the file system API. So the idea being that you can give access only to a specific file or a specific folder via the API. I would like to call out like a best practice here is that the permission prompt should be initiated by a user gesture, and the user should know the value of granting permissions. We have noticed with permission priming actually results to better conversions, and people actually accept the prompt. Versus in a lot of cases when there's no user gesture involved, people are just hitting cancel or block because they don't really know why they're asking these permissions. The site is asking these permissions. We have similar prompts on mobile as well. So this is like the equivalent of the allow block on mobile and the device picker. So things to think about when designing a prompt or when you're deciding to choose a prompt UI is what exactly is the user permitting access to. So is it device capability like camera or microphone? Is it a single file or is it an external device? So it's important to think about what capability or what information the user is permitting access to. The next thing is like, can we show a preview of what they're giving access to? So in case it would be file name or device name, and for how long. So most permissions in Chrome are persistent, but there could be cases like file system was a case where we decided to not go with persistent for origin trial, but like only as long as the tab is open. So being able to know how long you would want the permission to last before choosing a prompt or designing a prompt. Once we have granted access to a particular API, it's useful to let the user know in most cases that this particular API or this particular capability is in use. So we have 3 different indicators. So one is the tab indicator, which is at the top, which you see mostly for camera recording. You have an Omnibox indicator, and you have a site info popover. We also have this message bar, which comes up when you try to share the screen, like with example with Google Hangouts. We have similar indicators on mobile. So the site info popover. On mobile, we don't really have the screen real estate that desktop has. So we have something like a notification. So you would have seen this when you're playing media in Chrome, that you get this notification that comes up when you navigate away from the tab. And we also have like a message bar or toast that comes up when you try to share or when you enter full screen on mobile. So things to think about when choosing an indicator. And this is where things get fuzzy. But the idea is like how privacy sensitive is the information the user is sharing. And we reserve certain indicators, like the tab indicators, for most privacy sensitive information, followed by the Omnibox indicators. There are some cases in which we show both, but this requires us to be conscious of the fact that, hey, if I'm showing an indicator, it means that the user is going to be sensitive about this information. Secondly, Omnibox popovers there should be ways to manage or revoke settings. So this is a common pattern that's there across the UI in Chrome. And ideally, we would want the users to state and manage, to show the state of the permission and manage the permissions in one place. This is because of the fact that, yeah. Indicators? Yes. So PWAs actually don't have an Omnibox, but they do have a title bar or a menu bar. And right now we are showing the origin, and we have an overflow menu, which actually shows each of these permissions. So you do have a location indicator that shows up in a PWA.
Okay.
Yeah.
In some cases, that's going to go away too. So I'm wondering if there's like a one code place where it could show up in the Omnibox or in the ... menu or in the overflow of the URL in the title bar.
You're saying that could there be a pattern in which all of them interesting? Okay. I think we are trying to move towards a model like that. Right now, I think there is an understanding that the Omnibox indicator is far away from where the permission management happens. So there is at least within Chrome, the idea that we would probably want to merge those things. So I think the similar things that happen on the site would be inherited in the PWA. Yeah.
One question / comment about the indicators. So sometimes users seem to expect that all the indicators should be interactive, so that if you see, let's say, recording this red circle there, you should be able to click it and then maybe act on it. Basically, if you have
Pause.
granted access to camera, clicking that you should be able to disable that access. So I think it's not consistently implemented across Omnibox and the
Tab indicator.
yeah, exactly. So I think that might, I don't know if you have done user studies on that, but I feel that might be an area of study.
Interesting.
Whether those should be interactive.
Yeah. So I think I can't speak to this particular camera one, but there was some amount of like thought behind. So we have sound thing that comes up and you right click and you try to mute the particular site. Well, there was some amount of discussion around the area being very small to actually mute, unmute. And that's why we went to the right click to do that. So I imagine, but I get the point that there should be a way to probably right click and then stop the recording in the tab indicator.
Yeah, I think the expectation, like the consistency, I think Nielsen's rules, like if something behaves in some way, it should be, consistent. So it's like, otherwise it will be like, users will feel a bit silly. Did it not register my tap or click? Or...
Yeah. And that's fair. I think that's why the last point was like, we are actually working on system rules for like, how do we actually deal with tab indicators and Omnibox indicators and define how they behave and when they show up. So like this feedback is valid. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It's good to hear.
Yeah. The last part is settings. And a lot of APIs actually also end up impacting settings. And the important thing to remember is like, you should have the right defaults. So in most cases, we default to ask, but in some cases, we need to ensure that we don't put the burden of making the right choice always on the user. So like an example is JavaScript. The default is allowed because honestly, if there were a lot of ask prompts for JavaScript, people won't really realize what decision to make. And they might just hit block and a lot of websites could break. So now let's move into example APIs. I've called out 2 APIs that we worked on recently, which are like launching in 78 for origin trial. And the idea here is like, you would probably see some of the patterns that we discussed being used over here. But also I'll call out some of the things we found tricky and how we tried to address them. So the file system API, the popular API that everyone has been talking about for the past few days, this is the problem it's trying to solve. So this is Figma on the web. When you try to actually save a file on Figma, it just re-downloads a new file. This is a pain for a designer who makes multiple changes. And each time they make a change, they actually have to re-download the file, which is not great. This is what we're trying to do. We are trying to like open a file. And once you make a change in the file, I just go and hit save. And it saves the changes there without having to re-download a new file. So what was tricky? I think one thing which was very tricky, which I mentioned earlier, was choosing a permission model which made more sense. And we went about thinking about multiple models because at one point we were conscious of the fact that we didn't want to overprompt the user and make using these web applications feel cumbersome. But on the flip side, we were also aware of the fact that there could be a lot of rogue applications and we wanted to protect the end user from these bad actors. Hence, we explored 2 different permission models. The origin-based was more familiar with what we handle most things today, which is a persistent allow block. And the other one was like giving access to the parent folder. But finally, we decided to go with the grant model because it was most respectful of what the end user would expect when they share a file with the website. Next was helping users understand what exactly they're giving access to and the consequences of their choices. So strings seem like something which is really simple, but most often they are not. So I like to call out here like what a simple prompt and strings in the simple prompt are trying to do. So one part is trying to tell you what you're giving access to. Another part is telling you who is asking for this access, which is figma.com, not Chrome. And also the fact that how long are you giving access to this particular file? It's only until you close the tab. I have also added one of the alternatives at the bottom, really wordy. And it's not immediately obvious as to who's asking for this permission. In a lot of cases, people will think it's the browser which is asking me to save to the original file. And it's also not really clear as to how long will this access be around. So when I reopen this file and I see the prompt again, it might just be surprising. And the last one was like ensuring that this permission worked like all other permissions work within Chrome. So that meant having the Omnibox popover, having a way to like revoke access in the Omnibox popover, and even within site level settings, being able to understand how allow and block works, and what happens if a user decides to go and block this particular access and block file setting. What happens then? So we had to think through all those edge cases for this particular API. So process highlights, things that I really enjoyed on this particular API is like working really closely with Eng, PM, security, and privacy when we're iterating on these permission models. These decisions had a huge impact on what the end user experience was going to be like. Another cool thing was noticing that our permission patterns needed to be more robust and we needed new permission patterns. So it highlighted the need for a different permission prompt apart from allow and block. And also provoke thinking around persistence, something we're still thinking about as we introduce this persistence to this API as to how will users manage the files they have given access to. The next API, SMS OTP retrieval. This is a very frequently asked API because developers actually use phone numbers for a lot of different flows within their particular website. So sign up, login. This is an example of sign up on Lyft. And as you can see in the GIF, it's not really easy to actually enter your code on the Lyft website. You need to switch applications, go into messages, copy the code and paste it. This is what we're trying to do. And this is the demo that even Ayu showed the other day. But the idea is we want to make it faster so the person doesn't have to leave the application to actually enter this particular code. So what was tricky? We were trying to match the seamlessness of what Android offers today. So this is what Android offers today. You just, the code is automatically entered and it just automatically goes to the next step where there are no drop-offs. So this is what Android offers today, and this is what we were trying to match. However, on the web, it's easier to target users. So it's very easy to actually build a website and send a user there and verify their phone number and identity. So we had to provide a way to not only cancel the flow at any point, but also explicitly require the user to confirm when they're actually receive the message that they're okay with confirming their phone number or verifying the phone number. The last part, which is the most interesting, is the fact that based on partner feedback, so we reached out to partners, and this is the OYO sign-up flow, where they have multiple forms or form fields on that particular form sign-up, which made the blocking modal a no-go. It also was difficult for a blocking modal with multiple states for the developer to integrate it in their existing site, especially also because the blocking modal had a timeout. So we decided to move to a non-blocking flow, and we decided to move towards having an info bar for origin trial. So I think what was great in this entire process was like getting partner feedback really early. We were able to actually iterate pretty quickly even before origin trial and being able to see these verification flows in the wild. We are still going to get feedback during origin trial, but it helped us iterate on a solution we felt more confident about as a team before going to origin trial. So I would like to ask you guys towards the end, like, what do you think were your learnings while building these APIs out? Especially because like this has been a learning journey for me too. I feel like in this particular space, there is many challenges undiscovered in terms of UX, especially when it comes to understanding how people perceive web applications and how people perceive permissions versus native applications. So I'm curious about what you guys think were your best learnings while building these APIs out or in the process of building these APIs. And I guess if you have any more questions about what I presented, like, feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thank you. Great presentation. So I had a question about user studies. Do you do user studies as part of this UX process?
Yeah.
And how do you conduct them outside Google, like go to normal people? I mean, normal by the casual people who are not computer literate.
Yes. So yes, we do user studies, but it's, I would say we have started doing more formative studies. So versus going and showing a UI and saying, hey, does this UI work? We have more along the lines of do they understand permissions overall? And those are more long extended studies, but yes, we do have those kind of studies, especially planned for permissions. And the idea is also that we do consciously recruit people in from different backgrounds. We also sometimes try avoiding the Bay Area in general, because Bay Area population tends to be generally a little bit more tech savvy than the average population. So yeah, I mean, not for this, but there are some studies where we have gone down to LA or Seattle to avoid tech savvy population. Yeah.
Okay, that's great to hear. I think this type of, I mean, what we are lacking, I come from the, let's say, mainly web platform standardization side of things, and this UX expertise is, I would say, slightly lacking in that group. So I think we would welcome your and your team's involvement in that.
Awesome.
More of. So yeah, very, very helpful. If you can share your learnings in the open.
Yes. Yeah.
So that I could, for example, bring them to my groups for.
Oh, that would be great. I think that would be great in general for the experience that web users have today. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
I am on the tag, so I would say kind of the same. Like we read through a lot of these explainers and like being able to maybe see like a document and some of these, like what you're thinking about the UI flow instead of just a section saying this is the security considerations. I think that would be useful and would make at least some of the members feel more comfortable about these APIs going forward.
Yes. Agreed.
What did your studies say? Users understand permissions?
So we haven't, to be honest, we don't really have a study right now. There was a study done like a couple of years ago, but not really. Many people make a lot of decisions on the web very quickly, and not many people are reading. So, which is why I mentioned that sometimes permission priming is very useful and important. Like if Lyft tells you that, hey, we are going to be asking you for your location for ABC reasons, people understand that. And then when the Android or the Chrome prompt shows up, they will react positively. But in a lot of cases, I'm making a purchase decision and then you show me a notification permission, most people are going to hit block. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Namrata.
Yes.
Thank you for all the work you do. It's pretty awesome, and it's a pleasure working with you.
Oh, thank you.
So when working on APIs, it's easy to forget the users because we're targeting developers. Our users are developers, but we also need to cater to users. It would be very interesting to see if we could see videos of end users using our APIs, just to see, you know, it's kind of, it would be pretty eye-opening to see where they get stuck and what they don't understand.
Yeah. So I think this was something, we have a breakout session about collecting feedback from partners, I think today. And I think this was something that I wanted to like talk about during the breakout session is like, we get feedback from partners at a level which is higher. Would there be a possibility in which we could actually also talk to the end users of some of these partners? But yeah, I totally, I also feel the same way, that being able to see them actually use it in the wild is a better validation of what we're building. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I think it would make sense also to, it would be great to find a way to document these findings in a way to make it accessible to external people. You got
Yes.
some ideas about that?
So honestly, because there's no document right now, I haven't really thought about it. But as I am putting together stuff and as I think more APIs are going out, I was initially reluctant to build a document because I felt like you can't really come up with a standard based on like one API. But as there are more APIs going out and we see patterns and common questions across APIs, I think it definitely makes sense that when I start making a document, it should be public. Yeah. Yeah.
So for some of our APIs, there's at least discussion to use something like site engagement, which essentially means it's no longer really predictable because one user can say, look, I started this app and then I got this prompt. Another user tries to replicate their flow, and because their site engagement is higher, which they may not know, they don't get the prompt. So to what extent do you think this kind of no longer deterministic UX will, I don't know, require new patterns, or I don't know, just in general?
I think I can speak only from the example that I know. I think that's add to home screen, which Infobar, I think, which was to some point trying to look at site engagement score. So honestly, users don't think of this as an entire system. They're not really discussing with their friends that I saw this permission prompt, but did you? Some people do, but like a lot of people don't really talk about these things. But the point that I think this is important is like discovery of the feature versus the permission. I don't think people care about the permission. If it shows up now or if it shows up later, it's not really important. But say if there was a specific feature they were trying to find, I think that's something that people would be thrown. If like say for example, the icon shows up only 50% of the times, then I'll be like, what is happening? Because I'm used to seeing the icon like 100% of the time. But permissions, I'm not as sure because a lot of people are not focusing and thinking actively about permissions. Yeah.
I'm gonna, others want to talk to. I was gonna speak up, jumping back to capturing the documentation and all the generalized lessons. Like, so that would be magical. But even before we do that, it made me think about for the individual features, we go through a process and it's really interesting to hear about how we came to our final conclusion. Sometimes a few years go by and we might want to revisit our decisions or wonder, you know, why is it the UI working this way or not? And there's a trade-off for the amount of effort involved, but I feel motivated to try to capture some of the design process or notes.
Yeah.
And, you know, and it could be in a variety of ways, you know, either a simple, you know, UI design for this particular feature, and how we came to the conclusions, a slide deck that kind of went through some comparisons, you know, a blog post or something, right? And it would be nice if we were able to make it public. As well. That's great. But even internally, I would say, I don't know that we have captured in a way that we can easily find again these thoughts. Yeah, and I think that would be really useful.
So we have tried doing something like that on just the Chrome product team. So there is this group, a Google group called Chrome UI Review. So like I mentioned in the process, there's a directional approval stage and everything goes via the Chrome UI Review. So what we have done is like anyone can join that group, at least within Google, and follow along the discussions. It has been useful for me too, because like I mentioned that I've been working in this space for the past 8 months, but there have been some decisions that have been made even before that. And I have tried looking up in the same group and I have found threads that are useful. Again, it's not the most perfect way because you have to know and dig a little bit and like throw little keywords at the group to actually find it. But that's one way we're actually trying to do it today.
Yeah, that's great. All right, James.
Hey, thanks for everything. I think that this is really crucial. I think this is like the poisonous part of the Fugu fish, because if the users don't know what's going on, it really ruins the security of the web. You mentioned that a lot of times by default, if a prompt pops up, people click block, which I'm honestly okay with because that means they're safer. But I know a lot of people that, you know, they'll see it as like the, you know, agreements and they just accept, I don't care, just get me through, without reading it. I think that's the scarier part. So there are some things that somewhat concern me, like the block button is, you know, kind of like clear and has like a text, but then the allow button is like blue and shiny and it's like the one you want to click on. And has there been any thought process into like sort of trying to more default towards blocking? And I'm guessing that would give pushback from partners. But
so we did have discussions, especially I think with file systems, where we do have. So the default focus right now is on cancel, not on the save button. But one of the reasons why we switched to the blue button again is because of the fact that it felt like the Chrome itself was not helping you make a decision. It felt like the user had to end up deciding that, okay, make a choice. Whereas in this case, it's more opinionated. Like we feel that this is safe, which is why we're giving you this choice. But going back to what you said about like a lot of people actually hit allow, I think that is something with all of these APIs that we're launching, we are actually measuring. we're measuring the prompt deny rate and the prompt acceptance rate. And I think that will be very important for us to see across sites, like which sites are the prompt deny rates really high. And if it's going to be one of those sites which is actually like abusing the end user, like throwing this prompt out of context, then maybe there's something we have to investigate more and like improving the overall prompt. Yeah.
Sure, yeah, that's awesome. Is there like a maybe like a threshold even that we might set? So we're like tracking this. So if like a site is getting blocked a whole lot,
Yeah.
we're like, oh, let's look into this site. Is there something wrong with this? We have like plans to investigate sites specifically, or just the prompts?
I think a little bit of both. At this
That'd be
point,
awesome.
I can't really say because we haven't investigated it yet.
Yeah.
I think Thomas can answer to that.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to it. This is something that we're very actively doing for the notifications permission, where we're actually tracking it on a per origin level. And there are a lot of like things that you might not expect. For example, some of the most malicious actors actually have the highest accept rate. So when we were looking at blocking notification spamming, we're like, oh, great. If a site gets denied all the time, we'll just like not ask the user. But it turns out that some of the sites that are like blocking you from actually accessing content until you accept the prompt or things like that, like the really dark patterns, are actually the ones that have the highest accept rates. So now we're also looking at things like revoke rates as a potential signal. Like if I removed the permission, then we might limit the site's ability to prompt. And I'd love to extend that past the notifications permission.
Regarding prompts, so what are your thoughts on prompt fatigue issues? So I think some sites, I mean, is it just we need to do education for web developers that you shouldn't do that, or could the browser somehow mediate that? Make it easier for the user to not feel exhausted to see all these prompts, because we keep on adding this and it doesn't scale, as we know.
Yeah. I think all of those are concerns that I think the UX team has been debating and questioning all along the way for Fugu. I think it's both. I feel like there should be developer education also around the fact that in general, permission priming is important before you ask for permission. But on the browser side, there are thoughts around how are some smart heuristics that we can have. Right now, we have only safe browsing. And that's one way of like pushing back in case there's a malicious actor, and we can maybe look at those metrics for like not letting them prompt on a unsafe site. But maybe there are more metrics that we can learn. It's also very dicey, this particular area, because when the browser starts having opinions around which sites can do what, it's a fine line that we have to walk. So I think it'll have to be a little bit of both. On our sides, actually trying to see which are good ways in which we can reward good sites, but at the same time protect from bad sites. But I think easiest way would be to like educate in the developers, like knowing that most of the time if you're going to end up prompting, I mean, this is the well-meaning developers who are like want people to actually get access to all these cool capabilities, but don't really know how to do it. We will always have the problem of malicious actors, even if we put out standards and even if we put out guidelines. And I think that should be addressed separately. Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't have really clear-cut answers yet because this entire space is like moving. The permissions UX is moving, but all of the concerns that you mentioned is like something we're thinking about. Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Does anyone else have any more questions? Yes.
So just one. I guess so. In your process, when you're creating, sorry. I haven't had enough of my caffeine yet. I'm sorry. When you're creating mocks for things, so you showed the SketchUp ones. Are you creating those with real companies from like real screenshots, or are you just saying, "Hey, I'm going to use"?
It's a bit of both. I've found recently that I think actually going and looking at the developer's flow and the existing site is more useful than creating something which is more white labelish, because I think that lets you see the actual challenges that a person will have when they're trying to integrate the API. Versus, I think sometimes you can make we can make a really perfect solution and then it suddenly falls apart when it's actually being integrated on the developer's flow. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the reason I ask is when we do like our posts that we do, we can't grab those images flat out, and they're beautiful. Like I'd love to be able to do them, but because it says SketchUp or like it's a company name, is it hard for you to switch it to example.com and like switch out names so that it's like
not really hard
company?
Not really hard, like especially if it's something that we know at the beginning of the project, like I know that you might need something at the end, I would probably like start off with having like a separate thing for this particular this thing. So it's not really hard.
Okay.
It's just probably like when it comes later in the game, it becomes harder, I guess.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So maybe that's something we can work on together as we move forward on some of these, because your images are much better than what I screenshot. So thank you.
I have a question regarding permission prompting, and I'm not expecting an answer because I know it's an open problem. But ahead of time, permission granting versus contextual. Like contextual leads to permission fatigue. Upfront permission access leads to land grab. What is the current zeitgeist in terms of
So I have an opinion which I can share. I think contextual is the most respectful of what the end user wants to achieve as a goal. So if, say for example, if I'm trying to take a photo and you ask me for camera access, it makes sense and I'm like, sure, take it. But when I'm downloading the app, I don't even know that you have a feature that lets me take photos. And at that point, if you ask me for camera access, I'm going to be like, why do I need it? Because I think initially we had the runtime one also because the fact that maybe we can just get this out of the way. Like they don't really have to see this later, but it doesn't really lead to smart decisions or good decisions. So if you're really eager to use the app, you just say yes, yes, yes. Or if you are someone who's more privacy conscious, you probably might not even want to use the map going forward because you're like, I'm not sure why it's asking for all these extra permissions. So yeah, the opinion, at least currently, that I have is that it makes more sense to have it contextually. Yeah.
Apple has trained developers right now in the app. So the developers are responsible to have a leading screen prior to asking the permissions. This is not baked into any system. So it's very unstandard. So since we work on standards, like, do you think there are some ways to make that a bit more uniform?
I mean, if we could standardize it, it would be great. I think that's why I mentioned the idea of like having guidelines for developers, because I wasn't sure if we can standardize it. But the idea being that I think there's a certain power like we share as large companies. I think when Material put out its widgets, people just automatically started having a lot of Material-ish sites. So being able to actually have strong guidelines in place might end up influencing how how developers prime users before asking for permissions. But yeah, I would be curious if you can actually make this into a standard. Yeah.
Related to the previous question about upfront permission grants, the web has always had a runtime permission model. And one of the things that we discussed back in the early PWA era was the notion of grouped permission grants. So, if you sort of take apart what sort of legacy Android did, you kind of had upfront grouped permission grants that were all or nothing. And so in the sort of process of deconstructing application architecture, we sort of deconstructed permissions to be one at a time and always runtime. We decoupled install from offline ability. So those things have all come apart, but there are some tensions that kind of pull them back together. And some developers have asked us, like, could I request, I don't know, microphone access and accelerometer access at the same time for an AR situation? Do we have thinking, or is there a pattern that we're working towards to do potentially grouped?
Yeah.
And is that something that is like a high priority or a low priority, or how are you thinking about that?
Okay, and so we are thinking about bundling permissions. I think it also is important, like having permissions that make sense to be bundled together. So camera and microphone is something that we already do today, but like making sense that doesn't make sense if you have camera and location, because it might not go together. I think another thing that we're thinking about is like granularity. I might be okay with giving access to my microphone. I'm not okay with giving access to my camera. Right now, you can't do that. So being able to also achieve that when we're offering bundling. would be important. In terms of priority, I think permissions overall, like a rehaul of permissions, is a huge priority in the upcoming year. So this is one of the many changes that is being discussed as part of permissions. Yeah.
Okay, so I had a comment on Olivier's question. I think like it was been looked at before, like could we make some UI or allow the sites to actually explain why it wants a permission? But the problem is that you're creating trusted UI and the sites can lie. And then the user will lose all trust in the system.
Yeah.
So that's why it was kind of like rejected as an idea.
Cool. Do you want a microphone? Yeah.
Facebook bundles all their permissions, and so you give them access to all of your contacts and your address and your phone number and your dog's name and whatever.
I think the solutions have to be fundamentally economic. So in the app stores, your app needs to have a good rating, and I think that developers aren't just doing it because there was guidelines or it's best practice or right. They at the end of the day there was a
accountability,
economic motivation, and that's challenging for us to do. Although maybe some friends in parts of companies that do ranking could help influence the behaviors of web pages. But I don't know. I think we have limited. I think we have, in the browser itself, there's limited affordances for us to, create the economic incentives to get the behavior that we think is the best user experience.
One more remark on what Kenneth said with lying, and Olivier's remark. When you put PWAs in stores, they get reviewed like any other app, which means if they lie, they would get caught. I'm also a big fan of permission grouping, semantic, like you said, photos and geo, awesome. So I'm not sure if this is a stupid idea, it's just came to my mind right now. So if we have PWAs in the form of TWAs on the stores, could we maybe then have some more, actually some less restrictive permission grouping requirements that we say, look, this is in the store, it has been reviewed, whatever they say, they may not lie because else it would be rejected?
This is actually something that we have already done for the notifications permission. So now since, yeah, exactly. So I think we'd be more than happy to keep leaning in that direction. As far as I know, Android permissions today are fairly contextual and granular, but I think we would be more than happy to match whatever Android does in their experience and give the same affordances to TWAs.
Awesome. I guess it's next. Is it a break or is it Thomas?
We give Thomas 45 minutes. Do you want more than that? Okay. Yeah, okay. So let's be back here at 10:50.
Thank you.
Thank you, Namrata.